This is joint work with colleagues of mine, Camilo Garcia Trios, who is a new lecturer at University College London in the Maths department, and Marc Onrach of Open Gamma, and also honorary senior lecturer at UCL. He is actually here in the audience. So he has given us a lot of insight and background in the various challenges that are met in practice when attacking the problem of initial margining. And in a rather spontaneous, I would say, first discussion, we learned from him that initial margins nowadays, or at least a year ago, I think it's still the case, are actually not computed in a way that Camilo and I would have expected. Namely, that they're not computed on a dynamical basis. And in this talk, I'd like to emphasize what we mean by dynamical, because we think that this is our contribution to this very exciting area of research in the interface between, statistics, mathematics, and financial modeling. And this is one of the examples of work that I'm involved in where I think we are really, really close to real problems met in the financial industry, as opposed to perhaps much more theoretical work that I also enjoy pursuing. So, the introduction is probably not going to be very important here given the audience, but just to get warmed up. What justifies this work? It's been almost a decade, but the financial crisis is still in the background, especially when it comes to all the innovations that have been coming up through the various events that have unfolded. And I think we would all agree that one of the big changes in financial markets has been the clearing of transactions, which are more and more moving to a centrally cleared system, as opposed to from the traditional or classical or pre-crisis majority of trades that perhaps were executed on a bilateral basis. So this is what we mean by bilateral. I'm sure that you know exactly what all of this is about. So we have various market participants or clearing members, and they transact or accept agreements of transactions among themselves, but perhaps in a disorderly fashion or in a very ad hoc basis where the transaction is one-to-one, so bilateral. The new regime is perhaps more like this, where there is a central counterparty, a central organization, clearinghouses, who are the main link among all the participants in transactions. And the reason, of course, for introducing these CCPs are so that positions can be netted, better understanding can be achieved as to what are the risks involved in the various transactions and the various financial positions. Another change is perhaps a generalization of the concept of margining, and in particular, what these margins are for. So we have at least two types I'm aware of. The first one, which is the variation margin. And these margins contain the value of the positions, so of the assets that are intended to be transacted, up to the last valuation time. So perhaps the valuation happens once a day. So the variation margin accounts will reflect the risks that have been computed up to the last time. And as I said, they might be computed they are computed periodically, maybe once daily or once half daily or whatever is appropriate for the particular transaction, for the particular asset class. Typically, the margin is paid in cash, And what we consider here is an associated interest rate that is the OIS, the overnight index swap rate. I'm sure there might be other ways of paying the margins based on other quantities, but we shall assume in this talk that the basis is OIS discounting. The work that captured our interest and kept us busy for more than a year now is actually the computation of initial margin. And this margin, so this other type of margin, is in place so that potential gap risk can be covered, can be hedged. These monies or these reserves are ring-fenced, so they cannot be used in any other way. They're supposed to be there, stay there, not be touched. And they can be posted in cash or can be also paid in terms of bonds, potentially with a haircut. For this talk, it doesn't really matter, or it's not our main problem to make a difference between cash or bonds. So we have in our minds, we have just cash that is being paid whenever initial margin is required, whenever initial margin payment is required. So with the introduction of initial margins, of course, the question comes immediately as to how these margin payments are funded and what it actually costs to be able to pay these initial margins requirements. And perhaps the question is most important if there is a whole portfolio that needs to be transacted. And perhaps the question becomes even more important when one would like to know what the initial margin costs will be over a period of time in the future, say over the next 3 months or the next 6 months. And this is this question is dealt with by looking at what is the actual margin valuation adjustment. So take into account exactly this potential cost or this cost that will be incurred whenever initial margin will have to be paid. And so when looking at the question of how to compute initial margins, and more especially, how this initial margin should be computed on a dynamical basis, and this is where the question comes as to how to estimate, as in how can we compute an estimated value of initial margin in 1 week's time, in 2 weeks' time, in 1 month's time. The importance of having a dynamical framework for the initial margin computation is, of course, very much justified by this question. What will be the cost of incurred by having to finance these payments over a future period of time? And all these questions, of course, need to be addressed in a new interest rate paradigm, which is the multi-curve interest rate framework. So what we also would like to do is not only produce an abstract framework where initial margin computations are proposed or methodologies are proposed, and so that they are consistent with margin valuation adjustments, but we would also like to have them as close as possible to what is actually going to be implemented or what would make sense from a practitioner's point of view. So, looking at swap clearing and pretending that interest rates are computed classically or modeled classically in a single curve framework would not be really modern. So we agreed, Camilo and Mark, and together we agreed that from the outset we would be wanting to consider a multi-curve framework, especially because the workhorse, the example that we wanted to use to show the applications of dynamic initial margining and MVA computation was going to be a swap. So there are many questions that are related to each other, and this makes Well, this made the problem more complicated than what I thought initially. I thought that the biggest challenge was going to be producing dynamics. But producing dynamics and keeping in mind various regulations, various market practices, multi-curve, tractability, fast computations of whatever cannot be worked out in closed form or analytically efficiently turned out to be actually a rather big project that kept busy at least 3 months and for more than a year. But we are very glad. I think we have achieved something, and this is what I'd like to present today. So participants, and here, of course, we mean market participants, would like to estimate the initial margin, perhaps because they want to plan for any liquidity risk, or just because they would like to understand on what basis margin valuation adjustments should be computed. But this is perhaps easier said than done, because one of the things that we had to accept and put up with was that there are many, many clearinghouses, but not every clearinghouse has the same methodology that they use to compute initial margins. So we could not just take one as a representative of market standards and try to replicate their values. Another challenge was that calculating initial margins on the basis of historical data can be actually very costly, both in terms of time, in CPU time, and also because what history is going to be taken into account. There isn't much history. I think when we were looking at data, we had what, Mark, 2-3 years at most? So for statistical purposes, for modeling purposes, that was not deemed to be a very good guide. And then there is the introduction, there is the challenge of making various things work together. So we had on one side the pricing of options. Why? Because we want to price swaps. We would like to be able to calibrate the models that we use for swap pricing. And so we need to be able to compute swaptions. We need to be able to compute the swaptions with good mathematical ease so that they can be calibrated. And of course, this pricing, this option pricing, should be done with respect to what is known as the risk-neutral measure. But when you compute initial margins, then a risk-neutral measure perhaps is not the measure that seems to be the appropriate one. In fact, depending what you're going to be using the initial margins for, you are actually going to be interested in historical probability distributions, so the real probability measure. Immediately another question came up. Well, whose real probability measure? Whose statistical probability measure? Is there one that is used by every counterparty, by every clearinghouse? No, because if the clearinghouses are going to have different methodologies and they include different sets of information, then they will have a different view on what is going to be probable or not, or how much something will be, an event will be likely or not. So we had to agree that we were going to work with a subjective statistical measure. So we had to keep track of the various distribution distortions depending what probability measures we would be using, depending on what kind of task we would want to perform, i.e., are we going to be pricing options? Are we actually computing initial margins? And so on and so on. And then, of course, we have the data. And from the data, we'd like to imply distributions. And are the data sets that we have, are they representative? Are they actually telling us something useful for the models that we are developing? So this was not making the task necessarily easier. But of course, we liked the challenge and we got more and more interested. So very quickly, to show how we were thinking, or we think about this problem, we have this abstract initial margin formulation, very schematically. V is the price of an asset, say the price of a swap, the price process, and we look at this price process at discrete points in time, just for simplicity. We'll then be working with continuous time, but that's not going to be a modeling issue. So we say that we observe the price at t0, and we wonder what the price might be at t1, and so on for all subsequent dates. So at t1, we consider two clearing members, CM1, CM2, and they make their various payments. We have the variation margin accounts and the respective initial margin accounts, and if nothing happens, these amounts will vary according to the prices, according to the price movement of the asset to be cleared or the cleared asset. So this goes on, and but it becomes interesting when, for instance, one of the clearing members defaults. And here we take the example where CM1, so clearing member 1, defaults. What happens in that time? At that time, well, the clearing member, the default clearing member, will stop paying, will not anymore honor the agreement. And what the clearinghouse will have to do is to take some amount of the initial margin account and post it to compensate for the missed margin payment by the defaulted clearing member. Now, this equation here is just pure accounting. We have the M stands for the overall margin account. So we discount at OIS rate, so that is the RTM. And what we have to look at is, of course, the way the value of the asset that is being considered changes. So that is the DVTM plus whatever accrues given the interest rate R. And so overall, what you're looking at is this quantity here, where you'd like to compute the amount of initial margin at TM in such a way that on this side you will always have enough to compensate for any payment that is missed by the defaulted party. This means that we will want to use a risk measure, whatever might be appropriate. VAR, maybe you'd like to know something about the tails, so you're going to take expected shortfall. But what you will want to make sure is that this quantity here, given sign convention, will be less or equal than 0. So that the loss, the potential loss, due to not having an initial margin account in line with what is necessary to cover the risk is minimized. DT stands for the discount factor, where R is the OIS rate. So when dealing with risk measures, we have a set of conditions that we might want to ask from our risk measure. VAR will satisfy a few of these, and the expected shortfall will add coherence to it. These are just there to remind us that the choice of a risk measure comes also with requirements in terms of conditions that will have to be met. So we look at one example. We decide that we consider one subjective probability measure. This could be the probability measure adopted by LCH, one of the clearing houses. But if you look at Eurex, then maybe they have a different perception of what is risky and what is more risky. So the star there stands for subjective. And the risk measure that we want to consider is expected shortfall. And this is essentially the definition of expected shortfall. But the innovation here is this conditioning FT. So we want to compute the expected shortfall of the risk involved, which we will see is actually the increment, the price increment of the asset that is being cleared, given information at any future point in time. So that's where the estimation comes in. So we say, well, today we price our IM given what we know, but tomorrow, of course, we might know more. And we want to base our IM computation on what we will be knowing tomorrow. And we want to do this dynamically. So here, little t, we understand it being continuous, so that we don't have to care as to whether we compute the prices on a daily basis or we compute them on a minute basis. It really depends on the operations that are being considered. So here is the other innovation, perhaps. To us, it was very natural to propose the computation of initial margins, having chosen a preferred risk measure, in our case, expected shortfall, and base the risk that is involved on the increment of the price of the asset that is being cleared. So VT here denotes the price, say, of a swap, since the swap is the example we are considering. And delta is the time that gives us the gap risk. So that would be the interval over which we actually are concerned with the potential gap risk. And the gap risk arises from the increment of this price. So we wonder, what we want to model is how the prices will be changing over the time interval t and t plus delta. Okay. This means that we need to have, of course, a model to price our swaps, and we need a dynamical model. And of course, we need to discount accordingly, which also means that we need a model for the discount factor. And we want to have this in a stochastic way, because we assume that we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow or over the next 6 months. And in addition, we'd like to be able to compute these quantities, especially the risk measure, the conditional risk measure, with good efficiency and fast enough, and have control over the errors that are built if numerical schemes are necessary. So this means that the models that we will be producing ideally would have features that would simplify this computation. And this is where we decided that having Markov functionals or having Markovian risk factors would help. And this is what we mean here. So we assume that there is a function psi of time and the various sources of risk, so the price of the swap, the discount factor, and R being the interest rates that might be involved, such that we can come up with a simple pricing formula. Now, assuming that we have such a model that gives us a good framework to compute initial margins, then it is, of course, rather simple to just write down how we would be computing the margin valuation adjustments in such a framework. And this is the simple equation. I'd like to emphasize that you might be discounting at OIS rate, but the actual initial margin payments may not be funded at the same rate. You might have to pay a bit more to be able to borrow the necessary funds to cover the initial margin payments. And RF might depend on your credit quality, might be depending on whatever the market believes or the lender believes you are worth. That's why we have this spread. And so once we have our dynamical model for initial margins, because we want to compute our MVA dynamically, we are left with computing this conditional expectation where we consider the risk-neutral measure, as if computing MVA were the same as computing an option on IM. So I'll take you quickly through the underlying model class. Yes? You just arrived. That's amazing. Where would you like me to go back, Stefan? Here? Okay, please.
What do you mean by we assume the funding rate can be perfectly hedged?
We mean that, if you want to produce, say, a replicating portfolio for your funding portfolio, or for your funding contract, you may do so. or you may find the fundings that will be necessary to cover your initial margin. But of course, the rates may not be the same as OIS.
Why do we need such a section?
Because otherwise we may not be able to just say that there is an RF. Mark, do you have some better?
What's the question on which assumption we need? So is it on the Q, so that we can edge that type of option, or because actually the Q is just there to make it different from P. You can have P there also.
Yes.
It's not very important.
That's the other aspect. So, of course, you have the Q measure there, so the risk-neutral measure. But if you're starting from the P star measure, in the background we know that if there is this change of measure, we should be able to produce a replicating portfolio that links P and Q. But I don't want to focus to make this as the central part, and the reason being that we will actually be using, as I will mention very quickly, this change of measure so that we can capture certain statistical features under the subjective measure. Okay. So it's there for all of those people who are, whenever they see measures involved and they think about the change of measure and how to justify them financially, if that is an issue, we don't believe that that is the case, then of course we have the hedges. It means that we have exactly all the assets that we need to produce the replicating portfolio. So this connects to the first remark that I made about the existence of these assets, and so that RF can actually be backed out, if you like. So about the pricing models that we have underlying. So this is the question about how to model VT, the price of the swap, and of course how to model the discount factor that is driven by the OS rate. And the choice is not unique. So I'm not going to say here that this is the only type of models that might solve the problem. The problem being efficiency, speed of computations, transparency of the models, understanding what the dependencies are among the various risk factors. But we believe that this class of models actually does tick these points satisfactorily. So in 2015, but it appeared earlier this year with Stéphane Crépet, who just asked the question, and two further authors, we wrote a paper where we actually produce what is an example of a multi-curve framework. And the defining feature of this framework is that prices, say bond prices, swap prices, any type really of price that you may wish to develop, has a rational form. What does it mean? Here is an example. So say that this is a discount bond, priced at time S, maturing at time T. This is the form of the price process. And this is immediately, and it follows unambiguously, there's a one-to-one relationship to the associated interest rate, RT. And this RT is what is then identified as being the OS rate. So we use this model as a proxy for the OS rate. And rational, well, rational is obvious because this is a rational function. I should say immediately what it is. It's a martingale process, so it's a process that on average stays at the same level. And the statement about A being a martingale, of course, necessitates making sure what is the probability measure and what is the filtration that is being considered. Otherwise, the statement doesn't make sense. But all of that is under control and is, I think, rather clearly explained in this paper. The B's here are deterministic functions, and they are used actually to then calibrate to data, as we'll see shortly. And the P0S is the initial term structure of the discount bond system, which means that we have immediately an automatic calibration of these models to the initial term structure. So we want to use this class of models because we believe that it makes the computation of initial margins in a dynamical framework rather efficient and powerful. When you use this framework, you're going to see that there are actually three measures involved, three probability measures involved. And I want to spend 1 minute explaining what it is. It's not a source of concern, but actually we believe it's very convenient to have them. So P, for us, it's P star. We discussed that. It's the subjective probability measure associated with a clearinghouse. Q is the risk-neutral measure that we'll be using to price, say, swaptions, if we want to clear swaps. And M is an auxiliary measure. And it's used for mathematicians or whoever has got to compute the conditional expectations involved in a very simple or in a simplified way. Now, if you don't have an understanding how you pass from one measure to the other, that is, if you don't know or you don't have an explicit change of measure process, then this is, of course, problematic. Because it means that you cannot relate distributions that you use when computing options to the distributions that you want when computing, say, the initial margin. But in the rational class, the models that we are going to be using, we have a very good understanding of what the change of measure is between M and Q, so we know exactly how the distributions are distorted. And the reweighting between the two measures is given explicitly. And here I return to Stefan's question earlier. The change of measure that we need from M to P, so we can make statements about what the statistical distributions are, or the real-world distributions are when we compute the initial margins, well, those will be constructed explicitly, meaning that we are presented with a model that is described or given to us with respect to the M measure, because we can do computations much easier with respect to that measure. But then we're going to be asking what change of measure or what drift adjustment we should use when wanting to come closer to the statistical properties of the prices or of the initial margin charges that we're actually observing in the real world. Which is a little bit different from saying what is the usual replicating portfolio that justifies, the underlying asset price process with respect to the option. No, I repeat, because this is important, we want to go from M to P star, and the only objective will be to have our models have a statistical behavior that is as close as possible as to those observed when considering real-world statistical data. Multi-curve necessitates a model for the LIBOR. We have one for the OAS, which was little r. In the rational framework, we have this representation of what we call the LIBOR process, which is nothing else than a model for what is otherwise known as the forward LIBOR. This is a process that gives us a model, a value for LIBOR at any time t in between two fixed dates, say observation date and settlement date, And you'll notice that we have a freedom in the numerator, where we have a second martingale process, and the denominator is actually exactly the same denominator we had in the discount bond process, which means that we understand the LIBOR quotes being given in units of, say, the discount factor. Okay? So they are revaluated in units of the discount factor. The reason for this is that if you want to calculate a swap on LIBOR, the computation of that price process or the derivation of that price process will be simplifying greatly, to the point where instead of having to compute an expectation of a nonlinear function, with this trick here, you will actually be left with computing an expectation, a conditional expectation of a linear function. And that is, of course, a totally different matter in terms of complexity. Here it is. So suppose we want to compute the price of a swap at time little t. We have the sum over all the caplets, the forward rate agreements over the various tenors. And here we have our strike. And we can show that when using these models, where H is the discount factor driven by the OIS rate with respect to the M measure. That's why we don't see D there, but we see H. But we have a one-to-one correspondence between the process D, the discount factor we saw earlier, and H here. It can be shown very easily that the swap price process over all times little t will be again given in this very simple form, namely the rational form. And we will be working with a two-factor model, because the two risk factors that we are going to be using are in fact A1 at time t and A2 at time t. And if A1 and A2 are Markov functionals, it means, of course, that the swap price process will be a Markov function itself. So very easy to simulate, and so on and so on. We know the advantages of working with Markov functionals. And in particular, in the paper with Stefan and co-authors, we have shown that a shifted log normal process for the two A's is all we require, given that we're working within the rational approach. It's all that is required to calibrate robustly, satisfactorily, to the associated swaption market. So this is another plus, of course, because if we have to deal with models that do not calibrate the prices observed in the secondary market, in the swaption market, then we have to discard them already. So now we can go back to how we estimate initial margins in a dynamical framework. So we replace VT with, of course, the price process that we have just seen in the rational framework for the swap, and choose to work with expected shortfall, which is the risk measure that we prefer, just as an example. And then there is this correspondence, and the difference is that ideally you'd be working with the discount factor associated with the Q measure, with the risk neutral measure, because that's the data you use to calibrate the swaps, the swaptions. But, and this would mean that we need to work with the discount factor. But because we want to compute the expectations, the expectation that is underlying the expected shortfall, with ease, we want to work with the M measure, and we should work with H, because H is the numeraire associated with the M measure. And the problem here is that the expected shortfall is nonlinear. So it's not straightforward to essentially replace this with an equality. So we're going to have to accept an approximation. And the part of the work here is dedicated to understanding how good our approximation is between using this discount factor and the actual one that is associated with the M measure. But we can actually estimate this error. We can estimate the error associated with the approximation. And we can show that it's actually not too bad, because we just have a 5% relative error. And this is certainly something that we are happy to accept. And we can do something similar, of course, when changing from the work measure or the auxiliary measure M to the actual statistical one, the subjective one, P star, because after all, when we want to tell somebody what is the value of IM, they will want to understand it in terms of statistical distributions, so real-world distributions, not the distributions that we have used to compute our prices. But also here, we can analyze quite well we can estimate the discrepancies, and the results are actually quite encouraging, and so we did not feel this as being a shortcoming. Which then means that we can engineer a change of measure, so a rescaling or a drift adjustment between the measure that we like for computations and the one that we will be using when, for instance, comparing to statistical data. And this is exactly the new. So, in other words, we could have just invented a change of measure from M to P star in such a way that we can center the implicit distributions closest to what is actually observed in the real world, and not care about whether what we engineer is actually not distorting the prices too much, so that the actual two models with respect to the two distributions no longer make sense. So to make it robust, or to at least be able to inform as to what approximations are used, because we're using a nonlinear risk measure, we had to go through this analysis. Yeah, and in the background we have entropy minimization, and so on and so on, but I don't have time to go into this, and I don't think it's necessarily important. If it is, then we are about to complete the technical version of the paper, of the white paper that has been online on SSRN. But I think it's much more important to explain this graph, because this is exactly the effect that we generate through changing the measure from the probability measure that we use for computations, so the M measure, and the question of how do distributions look when we change to the real world measure, P star. So what we have here is our model distribution. So the dark part is the distribution, the implicit distribution that we get from our model. And the green part is the distribution that we were able to back out, in particular with Mark's input here, from CCP data that we were able to get our hands on. Or actually, perhaps I should say more, Open Gamma has been able to get. I have actually never been able to see the data, so I fully believe, I fully trust Mark on the validity of this real-world distribution that is based on data that has been observed or has been made available from a particular CCP. I forget if it was LCH or Eurex. It was LCH, isn't it? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. The vertical axis is the PNL. So the implicit PNLs of the margins, of the margin payments. And the change of measure, so the use of the change of measure, which is, again, not motivated by a replicating portfolio, but it's actually more motivated by trying to make the model distribution match better the distribution that has been obtained through the CCP data. So we shift and adjust. So that means engineering exactly a change of measure that, on one hand, satisfies the accuracy or approximation errors that we accept, as we showed earlier, and what is actually observed when looking at clearinghouse data. So we are, of course, not perfect, but after all, this improvement is just obtained by adjusting a drift. So it's a first-order approximation. But it shows the spirit behind the use of the change of measures in this work. Okay, I'm running out of time, so I'm going to be fast. Perhaps all I want to say here is that when you actually develop an explicit, yes, Stefan?
Excuse me, what do you mean by PNL CCP in the previous one?
Yes, so it's so if you look at the margins that have to be paid when you clear the particular asset, okay? So the question is, how is your PNL going to change when you clear given certain initial margin payments? That's what I understand.
Okay.
No, I'll come on the last slide on that. No, we have not considered, say, a portfolio of swaps. Anyway, this is, the red part is important, which just tells us that in the framework that we use, the IM process, so the dynamics of the IM process can be given in terms of a linear combination of functions that depend on processes observed at the time when the IM needs to be computed. So these are the Markov functions. And they can be given explicitly, so in particular Vx and Vx bar, so these two here are these expected shortfalls, and they can be obtained numerically. And what we see are these. So we have two cases here. The dark line is VAR, so it's using a risk measure, in this case VAR, and the lighter one with the circles is the same computation with expected shortfall. And we have a varying alphas, so varying, thank you Gareth, various levels of the risks involved, so VAR at alpha level or expected shortfall at alpha level. And we see that we have monotonicity that we need, so these functions underlying are going to be, are such that the numerics that is used in the background actually is stable and doesn't introduce any sources or any unnecessary sources of inaccuracies. And the computation here has been made by Monte Carlo with 4 times 10 million iterations. So these are the functions that essentially give us the initial margin values at a particular time. So we can now plot what initial margin payments, what is the level of initial margin payments that is expected. So suppose that we have initial margin computed on expected shortfall, so using the risk measure expected shortfall, and we have a 5 times 5 swap that we want to clear, and we use the M measure. So what we see here, what we plot, are the 2 percentiles, so 90% percentiles and 10% percentiles, and the yellow line is the mean. So this is essentially telling us that if we start at time 0 with, I don't know, $2.5 or $25 or whatever you need in terms of first payment. So this is saying, you know, you phone up LCH and you say, what is the payment that I should be making today? If I want to go ahead and transact a 5 times 5 year swap, they will tell you 2.5. And then you wonder what it might cost you, what is going to be the initial margin that will be needed to be posted tomorrow, and so on and so on, over the 10 years. The model that we use here, the framework we use here, will tell you that on average this will be the payments. And this stair is of course due to the payments. On the x-axis we have the time, so the time of the swap.
Measured in what units?
Years.
Days.
Years, 10 years. But it's not important as such, but typically you'd have years, yes. And the y-axis is the level of initial margin that will be required based on the framework that we use. Yes?
How does this converge with historical?
Yes. So this is, so what we can do is, so are you referring to backtesting by any chance? Is that what you have in mind? Yeah. So this is the part that we haven't yet developed. But one point, we have a perfect match, which is exactly the starting point. So this point here would be, you can calibrate the process, the initial margin process at time 0 to be exactly the one that, say, will be required by LCH or by Eurex. Taking on board historical data, that is precisely what we try to do when we shifted the distributions and we took the CCP data over the last 2 years. Okay, that's one attempt. But a solid back testing, I personally need to still understand what it would mean in such a framework. Questions that arise for me are, how do I deal with the fact that initial margins in the past by the clearinghouses might actually not have been computed taking on board the same type of information that we use in our model? One example is, and we think that this is something important coming out of our work, these initial margin computations are based or incorporate data from the swaption market, because the model that has been used here in underlying has been calibrated to swaption market, so the swap price process. I'm not sure, but I doubt that CCPs necessarily look at what the swaption market believes. You're shaking your head, and that I would agree. Look at what the swaption market believes, where a certain swap will be in 6 months' time, 1 year's time, or 2 years' time. But if I'm wondering about what the initial margin should be that is in line with potential moves of a particular swap, then of course I would say that it's rather natural to look at what the swaptions are, how the swaptions are priced for a particular swap. And this would be incorporated here. So when we look at the whole back testing, or how to calibrate or how to incorporate historical data, this for me would be something that I would want to keep in mind. It can be, and this is what we have been doing here, that both can be done independently, so that the model has enough flexibility to be able to accommodate the same, both sources of data. But I don't think the last word has been said. Yeah, this is just showing you that the fact that we are working with rational models and we're working with particularly advantageous forms of functionals and Markovian drivers makes the computation, the numerical computations, much faster when compared to Monte Carlo. So that's all. You can see it from the times that we need, depending on how many paths have been used to compute the actual process, or the evolution of the actual process. And I conclude with the corresponding plot for the margin valuation adjustment. So you remember that a bank could be asking what is the cost that they will be incurring due to the fact that they will have to pay certain amounts of initial margins over the next 6 months, over the next 1 year, and so on, once they decide to go ahead with a particular swap trade. And based on the picture that we had before on initial margining, and the formula that we saw earlier, where we took an expectation of a conditional expectation on the risk-neutral measure of the integrated initial margin payments over a future period of time, we see that the costs evolve as depicted here. And again, we have the 2 percentiles and the means in yellow. Of course, at the end of the swap life, we will have zero cost, because we also will have zero payments, as we saw in the previous slide. So again, the x-axis is time, 10 years, and the y-axis, I don't know, pence, pounds, millions of pounds. I'll leave it to you what would be a reasonable number for 500. I think perhaps a few comments. And in particular, future research. And in fact, it was already asked. So one is precisely the question about how to understand better as to how far we can go when wanting to incorporate historical data. Again, we need to remember that we have just 2 to 3 years of data, and rather sparse, rather heterogeneous, meaning you get one result perhaps for LCH, and then you get another one for Eurex. So I'm certainly not prepared to make any speculations here as to how that is going to be done. I firmly think that what we should really highlight, which was quite astonishing to me, is that when you want to assess the risk that you might be incurring in the future given a certain trade and certain margin charges, you're not going to be looking at the information that is already available and readily available in the swaption market. So one simple question would be, well, suppose that you want to use swaptions to somehow hedge precisely the costs that you will have to incur. Well, you'd like to have your initial margins computed and thus also the MVA in line or at least reflecting some of the information that is readily available in the swaption market. And this is certainly not done as far as I know, and you seem to agree nowadays when publishing the required initial margins. And the other one is in fact twofold. One is the portfolio. We are rather optimistic there. Because if you consider a portfolio of swaps, swaps involve sum, and the portfolio will involve again a sum. So we have sums of sums, and we know how to deal with those kind of expressions. So it's not going to make the expression for the portfolio, as we saw it, for instance, for one swap, necessarily much more complicated to the point where we have to believe already now that this is not going to go through with a portfolio of swaps. This is, I'm not as confident to say the same when we look at multi-currency. And the reason there is because we have to incorporate a model for FX and understand exactly how the valuations change when we integrate more than one currency. We have ideas, but it would be premature to make any statement. I think I'll stop here, and that's it. Thank you very much. You had one? Yes?
That would actually sort of the objective function would include the MVA or the volatility of the IM and etc.
Sorry, can you repeat the bit about optimization? What would you envisage optimizing?
Yeah, so an objective function which would include, say, the minimizing the volatility of the future initial margins, or the cost of the MVA overall.
So let me see if I understand what you're thinking. So what you're saying is, of course, if I consider a portfolio of swaps, I may have risks that in quoting marks might be it might be possible to net out or can balance each other. Is that what you have in mind? I actually haven't thought about that, but I think that would be certainly an efficient way of proposing the computation of initial margins if you were to trade a portfolio. In fact, I would say that if I'm a trader, I'd want perhaps a benefit from actually transacting a portfolio instead of just one name. One swap. I don't know. I don't know what the optimization would do to the actual framework. It's not clear to me where the optimization would sit. Would it be where we actually produce the swap portfolio? So is there an optimal way to describe the price process for the swap portfolio in terms of the Markov functions that we have, or would it be at the level of taking the the expected shortfall? I'll remember the question. Thank you.
Have you considered extending this approach to OTC derivatives, where we're going to have this standardized initial margin model, SIM, right? So that could alleviate some of the issues with P star, right? Because it's going to be effectively fixed, right?
Yes.
And you know what those parameters are.
Yes. No, I haven't. We haven't. That's the honest answer. Whether it would alleviate, to use your word, and understand what you're thinking is, you just have one subjective measure, you don't care. I'm not sure. The reason is that we have a P star there just because we want to highlight the fact that you might not get the same initial margin process if you change clearinghouse. Of course, once you choose your house and you want to know what the implicit emergent margin process and thus the margin valuation adjustment will be if you decide to go ahead and go through LCH, then that is fixing it. So I don't see where that would be different from OTC. On the other hand, if you have OTC, then I think, if I understand where you're coming from, then OTC is sort of bilateral, right? So it's again, you with me. And then the question is, well, what happens if now I don't trade with you, but I trade with another? Are we still going to be using the same P star that I have been using with you? Does every OTC trade in the market have the same understanding or the same perception of what risk is in the real world? I doubt it. Because that is exactly where heterogeneity comes in financial markets, and which we gladly just brush under the carpet when we produce our models, or some of the models. So I don't necessarily see where the actual simplification would be. I think we are already using it. That could be the case, yes. So if certain OTC trades, there is longer history, more data points, then yes, then perhaps yes, yeah.
So from the point of view of the CCP, they care about the solvency of the counterparty, so they don't care about its individual trade whatsoever. They care about the universal trades you have in the CCP.
Yes.
And that is across all types of derivatives.
Yes.
But that also includes the credit risk of the counterparty, being the most important.
Absolutely.
And many of these derivatives could be derivatives on the counterparty themselves. How do you deal, and that is the real world problem of the CCP. So how would you deal with that?
Yes, so I'm very glad that you're asking this question, because I have actually not addressed this point clearly, I think. So I should perhaps have started my talk by saying, whose perspective do we take when addressing the problem of computing initial margins on a dynamical basis? I think I have been going from one perspective to the other without announcing, really. So you could take the perspective of a bank who would like to have some sort of standardization across the CCPs, and know that CCPs will use a certain methodology, albeit they're not going to tell you all the details, as to how they will be computing initial margins tomorrow and for the next, say, 6 months. That's perhaps the one that is most obvious when looking from what I just presented. If you take the perspective of a CCP, which is not necessarily what I have had most of the time in mind when working on this, then I think what will be important there is what would make a CCP particularly competitive. I think that if they were to offer a methodology that is dynamical, they might actually be able to charge less without foregoing a good understanding of risk. So without risking that initial margin accounts will be outside what is actually necessary to cover the potential risks. And the question about what you do when you have derivatives, what derivatives were you alluding to? Derivatives on the actual positions that are traded, or derivatives on the counterparties? We have not looked at this. The only point where I could see a link is actually when we look at RF, so the funding cost that a certain clearing member will have to take for being able to borrow. So maybe that's where we have the counterparty bit, but I have not looked at it from that. So perhaps you can help there and tell us exactly what the interesting question would be.